Hey guys, it's Erin, and today I'm gonna do my September wrap-up. So I'm in a new place, 98% because my cat is sleeping in my chair and I don't want to move her. Yeah, I'm that person. Apparently, didn't know that until right now. Don't move. She moved. Anyway, September wrap-up, here we go. So I had no idea how my September reading month would go because it was kind of like the beginning of school. I had like a week or like 2 in August of being in school, a week and a half, something like that. But I didn't, you know, it's the first 2 weeks of school, like it's hard to tell. And I did actually get a lot of reading done those 2 weeks. The month of September, however, was good and bad. Good, I guess. It was better than I expected. Ooh, all the books. So I read 9 books. This is 8 of them. Of those 9, 4 were for school and 5 were for fun. And that actually ended up being a pretty good reading month. I didn't feel like I wasn't reading because I was reading a lot of stuff. A lot of my readings for school this semester have been like critical articles or chapters out of academic books, and so I'm not reading like a lot of whole books this month, which is fine. That's just how it goes. Yeah, so 4 books for school and 5 books for fun. As I didn't really know how things were gonna go, I think that's pretty good. My goal really is just to not ever have a month where I don't at least read 1 book for fun. When you're in an English PhD, because you're doing so much reading, it's easy for you to kind of burn out on reading and not want to read anything for fun, or not feel like you have time to read anything for fun, because really, if you're gonna read something, you should read for school. But for me, just like carving out those spaces to read stuff has been really important. So I'm kind of deliberately reading things that are very different from what I'm reading for school, and I find that's helpful, which I kind of knew it would be. So, pro tip, if you're wondering. The first book that I read, I don't have because it had to go back to the library, and that was The Undead Girl Gang by Lily Anderson. I really liked her first book, The Only Thing Worse Than Me Is You, which is a kind of like modernization of Much Ado About Nothing, and I thought it was really fantastic. Her second book, I was like, it was okay. And so people have been raving about Undead Girl Gang since it came out earlier this year, this summer sometime, I think. And so I was excited to read it because I like her writing, and everybody had been raving about it. So this is about a girl, I think her name is Maya, I might be wrong, I'll correct myself if I am. And her best friend dies in an accident, except the main character is not, she's pretty convinced that her friend was murdered, and part of that reason is because 2 other girls had committed suicide just like a couple of days before her friend died, and she finds that like suspicious. And so she decides, since nobody believes her and the police are like, no, it was totally an accident, like case closed, she performs a spell and brings her friend back from the dead, except she also accidentally brings back the other 2 girls who have died, and they were like the school's mean girls. So this main character, who's overweight, who's definitely not part of the popular crowd, they made fun of her, and her friend Riley was kind of her only friend, is not thrilled with having to deal with these extra people, and together they try to kind of figure out what happened. It was a fine story. It wasn't my favorite. I did like some of the way that a lot of the things the main character did were driven by her grief, and I think it kind of took the way she was feeling seriously, which is really important. It also afforded her the opportunity for some kind of like personal reevaluation, and she was able to kind of re-examine some things she took for granted and realize maybe she had a little bit more control over the way her world was than she thought she did. So that was nice. But otherwise, it was just kind of like, it was fine. So that's my opinion. I know a lot of people really loved it, and I don't really have a reason that I disliked it. I didn't connect with it very deeply. The next book I finished was Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. This was a reread for me, and I was really excited to have the chance to reread it. It's not the kind of book that I would have like picked up to reread anytime in the near future, just because it's 800 pages long and I have other things to read. But having the chance to reread it was fantastic. This is Dickens' last completed novel. It's not considered one of his best. He does some things a little bit differently. It's not quite as realistic as his sort of middle period great novels like Great Expectations and Little Dorrit and Bleak House are kind of like the top ones in critical opinion, but this one is my favorite. This is about our mutual friend, which is kind of, it's this weird web of characters. Dickens' books always have a lot of characters. Usually there's like a main plot and a subplot, and the characters from each kind of move into each other's spheres in interesting ways. Same thing goes with this, but there really is this kind of very interesting web, and it centers around John Harmon. John Harmon Sr. was a self-made man who was a horrible, bitter, angry miser who alienated his whole family, and when he died, left his fortune to his son, also named John Harmon. John Harmon Jr. went and was like farming in South Africa because he didn't want to be anywhere like near his father, and his father kind of gets the last laugh in his will because he leaves all of his money, £100,000, which is a lot of money, to his son on the condition that the boy marries this girl that he's never met named Bella Wilfer. And there's not really a good reason for him to marry this particular girl. She's from a middle-class family, and she met John Harmon like 4 times when she was like 6. But she had a temper and he liked it. So he's absolutely like meddling with his son. If the son won't marry Bella, then the money all goes to Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, who were the caretakers of Harmon's property. And they're, you know, working class people. And so anyway, at the end of chapter 2, we learn that John Harmon is dead, the younger one and the older one. He came back to take his father's property and to marry Bella Wilfer, and then he died. And the story kind of follows a number of people who touch the kind of like centrality of Harmon. So we follow Bella and her family. We follow the Boffins, and the Boffins recognize that Bella was kind of like cheated out of a potential for a good future, so they kind of like adopt her, and so we get her and her circle. We get the secretary to the Boffins, John Rokesmith, is an interesting figure who is in this circle. Then like there's the lawyer who handles the Harmon estate. There's and his circle and his friend who is in love with this girl who was she and her father discovered the body of John Harmon, and so it, like and around it goes until everybody is connected to everybody else in some interesting way, and they're all connected to John Harmon, the dead John Harmon. It's a really interesting story. It's a love story in a couple of senses. There's 2 romances. There's some really interesting female characters in the story that I appreciate. Bella is one of them, and Lizzie Hexam is the other. Especially Lizzie, I really admire. She's the poor daughter of basically like a riverfront scavenger, and she sacrifices a lot to make sure that her brother gets a better life. She works really hard. She is in a kind of timely and interesting situation because her brother's schoolmaster is in love with her, but she recognizes that he's not a very nice person, and so she keeps rejecting him, and this makes him angry and causes problems for her. So that's an interesting kind of subplot that goes on. As with Dickens, there is a happy ending, so if you're wondering, it does all work out. And anyway, it's a little bit like a fairy tale. There are some things that happen that are a little bit unbelievable and a little bit symbolic, so don't go expecting like it all to make perfect sense, but I still love it very much. The next book I read was Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. This was for a class. I don't read Freud for fun. If you do, good for you. I have a hard time reading Freud. This was one of Freud's later works. It's very much more philosophical than like psychological. He is thinking about like, how did civilization come to be and why are we so unhappy? And I think sometimes he offers some pretty interesting solutions. My problem with Freud is that he's really hard to read. Even in this book, which is a little bit more kind of like thoughtful, he's kind of just like thinking through issues. It's just Like I feel like I could tell you what this is about, but if you opened up to a random page and were like, explain what's going on here, I don't think I could. And neither, my professor said the same thing, so it's not me, it's Freud. And that is all I have to say about this book. I did not give it a star rating. And that was the second time I read it, so we're done now. During that time, I decided to do some rereading because I needed some old stories that I enjoyed. You know what I'm gonna do? There. So I reread A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. My plan was to reread the whole trilogy, but I just didn't. So that's fine. This is about a woman named Diana Bishop. Diana is a very successful academic. She studies the early history of science, when science was still kind of alchemy and still kind of magical. And she's in Oxford and studying at the Bodleian, which is the big library at the University of Oxford, and they have a lot of old manuscripts that she's looking at, and one of the manuscripts that she calls up is enchanted. And she recognizes that it's enchanted because she's a witch. In Diana's world, there are more than just humans. There are 3 other races. There are vampires, there are demons, and Daemons. They're kind of like very either like genius people or kind of really mad. It has more to do with like the way their brain works. And then there are witches, and they all kind of, their goal is to like not let the humans know that they exist because that's dangerous, right? It's bad for you. And I like Harkness's kind of iteration of this world because the different races are actually like their biological differences on a chromosomal genetic level, which is really interesting. Diana doesn't want anything to do with magic because her parents died when she was young, and she feels like it was because of their magic that they were killed, and so she's kind of rejected all of that. And so she sends this magical manuscript back, which turns out to be either a good or a bad move depending on where you're standing from, because it was a manuscript that a lot of people wanted. They think it holds the key to understanding like the origins of all of the different creatures. Everybody wants it, including a vampire named Matthew Claremont, who's very old. And Diana and Matthew start to work together because she's decided that his motivations are good, and eventually they fall in love, and it becomes like a whole big thing. But I really like the story because it takes this kind of like idea of magic and the kind of like even the like paranormal romance, and it really matures it, and it roots it really deeply in history and in science, which is just really interesting to me. I like that the main characters are academics. I think that's a lot of fun. The writer is herself a historian and professor, and so she's writing from a position of knowledge. It becomes quite a complex story, and it thinks about a lot of things about origins and about racism in kind of like a distant way, because it's like interspecies racism instead of like racism based on color and stuff like that. So I like this book. And the sequels get better. This book is a little bit uneven. It was Harkness's first novel, and you know, there's some first novel mistakes in it. I don't think that diminishes the value of the story, and those mistakes go away in the next 2 books. I give this one 5 stars just because I like it so much, and the second book has time travel. It's fabulous. The next thing I read was Charlotte Temple by Susanna Rowson. I kind of don't know how to rate this one. This is a story about a girl named Charlotte Temple. She's English. She's at boarding school. Her wicked French teacher, who teaches her French and is also French, enables her to start seeing a man who is a soldier. And together, the French teacher and the man convince Charlotte, who's like 16, to run away to America with this guy. At the last second, she changes her mind, but it's too late, and then stuff happens. I don't know whether to spoil this so I can like talk about it or to like leave it hanging. There are a lot of things I don't like in the story, and when I first read it, I was kind of angry about the whole thing. But when we talked about it in class, I kind of came around to understanding why this story was so important. Although Susanna Rowson was like English and then American, and she originally published this in England, it was massively popular in America. It went through like a bajillion reprintings. It was everywhere for like 100 years. And when I read it, like, me and the other members of my class were like, I don't get it. But it is actually kind of interesting and maybe a little bit proto-feminist, because what Rowson does is she takes a kind of very common story, right? Innocent young girl is seduced. She ends up dead because, oh no, you can't do that kind of stuff. Sorry, I spoiled it for you. And yet, she kind of complicates that narrative in a number of subtle ways. So if you do read this, read it carefully and then think about it and then read it again. I would also recommend getting this particular edition. I don't know if they actually print it anymore. It's the Oxford Early American Women Writers series. But the introduction by Kathy Davidson is really, really helpful to kind of like contextualize why the book is important. So I gave it 2 stars, maybe 2.5. I don't like it that much, but I kind of like understand it. This is where star ratings are complicated. The next thing I finished was Sinner by Maggie Stiefvater. This was another reread for me, and this is one of my favorite books. It just gives me happy, warm feels. This is a companion novel to the Shiver trilogy, and I know a lot of people who came to Maggie Stiefvater via the Raven Cycle have tried to read the Shiver trilogy and like struggled, and me too. And then I read Sinner, which came out and just like sounded fun and interesting, and so I read it, and then I fell in love with the characters. So if you would like to read Shiver but are having trouble getting into it, maybe try Sinner first. It doesn't spoil the Shiver trilogy, and it's just like it's just a fun story. This is about Cole St. Clair. He is one of the minor characters in the Shiver trilogy, and also about Isabel Culpepper. And in the Shiver trilogy, they kind of had a relationship, but it ended up not like sticking. So that's the only spoilery bit about this one. The thing about Cole is that he's massively famous musician, and the other thing about Cole is that he's a werewolf. And in the Shiver world, werewolves don't change based on the moon cycle, they change based on the weather. Except Cole, when he was a massively famous musician, decided to experiment with every drug that he could find ever, and so the rules don't quite work for him. And also, Cole has figured out how to force his body to change through an interesting kind of like chemical process, and he kind of has started to use it as a way to like escape his brain. Cole's a really interesting character because he's like massively irresponsible. He's one of those like super engaging people that's also like really, really like hurting and sad on the inside. He's super intelligent, like basically genius level, and he just like can't quite cope with his brain. And Isabel is somebody who helps him do that, and it's part of the reason that he wants to pursue her. So Cole comes to Los Angeles, where Isabel is now living, and he does it partly because he wants to reconnect with her, and then also because he is filming an online reality TV show. So the tension between like him trying to repair his relationship with Isabel and also him being on this reality TV show where everybody's hoping he's gonna screw up is quite interesting. And it's just kind of a chance for both of the characters to grow up a little bit and to use this opportunity of re-entering each other's lives to really think through like what do they want not only from each other, but like have they stagnated? Do they need to make some changes in their own lives? I'm making it sound more intelligent, I think, than it actually is. I think it's a fun story, and I like Cole's sort of frenetic energy. And Isabel is like a razor. She's sharp and angry, and it's kind of fun to read. The next thing I finished was Sabriel by Garth Nix. I gave this 4 stars. This was not a reread. This is about a girl named Sabriel. She was born in the Old Kingdom to the Aborson, who's like kind of a wizard. Not really, but we're gonna use the word. But he sends her to school in the kingdom to the south that's divided by this like magical wall from the Old Kingdom, and she grows up kind of in the boarding school there. She does learn magic, but just kind of like not as much as she would if she had grown up in the Old Kingdom. But the Old Kingdom is a political mess, and her father doesn't want her there. However, right before she graduates, when she's 18, Sabriel is supposed to meet her father, and he never shows up. And she knows that something is wrong, and so she crosses the wall and goes into the Old Kingdom to try to find him. And in doing so, she finds out more about herself and about the history of the Old Kingdom and why it's so broken, and she realizes that fixing some of the brokenness and also becoming more, like, becoming who she was supposed to be and finding her father are all tied up together. This is a YA fantasy from the 90s, and it's just like a really good, solid, classic YA fantasy. There's a reason it's still in print. It was a well-rounded story. The characters were all interesting. There's a magical cat that's fabulous. The fantasy world was really well developed. It had a nice, like, deep sense of history, which is something that I always look for in a fantasy world, and interesting magic system. It just, like, was a really solid story. I'm excited to read the next one. The next book I finished was Vanity Fair. Oh my goodness. I felt like I was reading this book for forever, although really it was maybe like 2.5 weeks. That being said, I did actually, like, enjoy this. Probably like 3.5 or 4 stars level of enjoyment, and I'm glad that I read it. Vanity Fair is one of the, like, great Victorian novels, and I think it's worth reading. Thackeray starts the story in the 18 teens when 2 girls leave school, and we follow these 2 girls. The story is about them. They're the main characters. One girl's name is Amelia Sedley. Amelia is kind of pretty, but she's just like one of those sweet, nice girls that everybody loves. And then her friend is a girl named Becky Sharp. And Becky had been at school as a kind of like work-study student, and is the daughter of the now deceased art teacher at the school, which is why she's there. Amelia's family is like upper middle class. Her father works in finance in the city. They have a nice house on Russell Square. Her brother is has a government job with the British East India Company, stuff like that. And the story just kind of follows Becky and Amelia through the next 15 or 20 years. Their trials and tribulations, of which there are many, their joys, of which there are some. Their husbands are in the military, so they end up in Brussels at the Battle of Waterloo. They have kids, but the stories kind of diverge in really sharp ways. Becky is a social climber. She is a cheater. She is a liar. She has very few moral bones in her body. She's an excellent actress and totally leverages that to get what she wants. She's selfish. She's a terrible mother. The novel is subtitled A Novel Without a Hero, and that's definitely what is referred to, whereas Amelia is a good person, but she's also not the most interesting one of the story, and she ends up suffering quite a lot. Her father loses all of his money and other things that would be spoilery, and the novelist kind of just like bounces back and forth between the 2 characters. It's very interesting, like, to follow their lives. One of my favorite things about the novel is the narrator, who is very much a part of the story. Towards the end of the story, he actually says, "Oh yeah, and it was here that I met so-and-so and so-and-so and started to learn about their stories." And he has lots of thoughts and opinions, and it's quite humorous. If you're looking for a good, like, novel to sink your teeth into, maybe try Vanity Fair. At some point, Amazon is going to release an 8-part series adaptation of Vanity Fair that looks really good. So if you're on the fence, maybe hang out for a sec and check that out. There is a movie from a while ago starring Reese Witherspoon, and I actually saw it before I read Vanity Fair, and I kind of wish I hadn't, because I feel like it spoiled all of the interesting things for me, and also made me really confused about the timeline, because it's such a long novel and it takes place over such a long time, and then compressing it into, you know, a 2-hour movie or whatever, like, is just, it cuts a lot out, and it made it hard to follow. Last book I finished was The Hobbit. Technically I finished this on October 1st, but we're just gonna pretend. I love The Hobbit. It is my favorite. And this was like a reread. I don't know. I first read The Hobbit when I was in 5th grade, and that was almost 20 years ago. And I have read The Hobbit at least like once a year since then. So this is about a hobbit named Bilbo who is very content with his boring staid life, and then a wizard shows up and says, I'm going to send you on an adventure, and he's like, how about I don't go on the adventure? And the wizard's like, no, how about you do? So he goes with a bunch of dwarves to take back their home from a dragon, and it's a charming, delightful story. I am doing this for a read-along on Instagram, but also I find that in the fall and also just like in this like really busy time, I really enjoy having a book going kind of in the background that's just like coming home. So that was my September reading. It's pretty good little stack there. I think of the new books that I read, I didn't actually read a lot of new books, but of the new books I read, Sabriel was definitely my favorite. I'd love to hear what your favorite book of September was. How was your reading month? Have you read any of these books? What do you think? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Yeah.